10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 239. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 239 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. So great to have all of you back with us, and thank you for joining us week in and week out. Really excited to start a new series. This is a listener-requested series of lessons about the minor blues, and this is something that we really haven't approached yet on this podcast, and this is a very valuable progression that is played all the time. And this progression, like any other, gives us a lot to explore in terms of jazz language and skills that you should have as a jazz musician. So just a reminder, if you'd like to get the PDF to this episode plus a backing track and PDFs to every single other episode that we've ever done, you can sign up to become a patron of this podcast. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, Patreon is a great platform that allows you to support the creators that you love directly. And that's what we do on this show. We are a listener-supported podcast, and we've got a great community of people over on Patreon. If you'd like to get signed up, you can go to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, and you can investigate all of the benefits that you will get. And I've got a few people to thank this week. I'd like to thank a brand new $5 patron, Bob, and I would also like to thank Philippe for editing their pledge up to $5 from $3 to get those extra benefits that we offer. So make sure you head over to Patreon, check it out. Very, very small amount of money for a lot of benefits over there that will really bring your playing to the next level. So again, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, get yourself signed up today for instant access to all of those materials. Okay, so let's jump into our series on the minor blues here. I'm sure a lot of you out there are familiar with this progression. You've played over it. We actually touched on this progression way back in episode 194, but we didn't really talk about what was going on. The episode was simply an etude about reading. It was at the end of our series on getting better at reading. Now we're going to really dive into this progression. We're going to start this week with an overview. What makes this progression unique? What makes it different from a regular old major blues? And then we're going to dive in subsequent episodes to some things you can do with the progression that are going to make it a lot more interesting and give you some tricks to bring your playing to the next level over this particular progression. All right, so let's start with the similarities between the major blues and the minor blues, and then we'll talk about the differences between the two. So at this point, you should have the PDF worksheet from this episode in front of you. What I've done is a Roman numeral analysis on the actual chord progression, and you can see everything I'm talking about sort of laid out in front of you. So it'd be a good idea to have that with you while we look at this. So let's start with the similarities. One big similarity is that it's 12 measures long, which is exactly the same as our traditional major blues. So still dealing with that 12 measure progression, that should be very, very familiar to you. And there are other similarities here. So the first one would be is that we're mostly leaning on a 1 chord and a 4 chord, right? So the first 4 measures are based around the 1 chord. The second 4 measures, we modulate to the key of the 4. And then another similarity is that in the third line, so measures 9 through 12, we do a turnaround. So it's structured 1 chord, modulation to the 4 chord, come back to the 1 chord, do a turnaround, and then we're back into the top of the form. So it should be pretty easy to grasp the way that this progression works. But now let's dive into some of the subtle and not so subtle differences between the major blues and the minor blues. So the first one, which is extremely obvious, is that it's based off of a minor 1 chord. So we're in a minor key. So you'll notice the 1 chord is not a dominant chord anymore. It is a minor 7th chord. Same thing with the 4 chord. Now, the other maybe not so obvious difference is that we have to slightly adjust what we're doing in terms of our cadences and our turnarounds to adjust for the fact that we're in a minor key. Now, one other thing that you may notice right off the bat is that the turnaround is different. It is different than what you would normally see, which is a 2-5-1. And we're going to get into that as we go through the progression. So let's just dive into the progression from the beginning, and we're going to just explain everything as we go through it. So the key that I've chosen, I think, is the most common key for a minor blues, and that is concert C minor. So that's what we've diagrammed out on the worksheet for this week, is minor blues in the key of C minor. All right, so we start with our C minor 7 chord. And what you're going to notice is we play this for 4 entire measures. And that's a little bit different than the major blues. In the major blues, typically what we do in measure 2 is we go to a 4 chord. But in the minor blues, we just stay glued to that minor 1 chord for an entire 4-bar phrase. So the first 3 measures are going to sound just like this: 2, 3, 4. Now what we see in measure 4 is our first step outside of that minor 1 chord. And what you're going to notice is it stays on the 1 chord, but something happens. It changes to a dominant 7th chord. And why would we do this? This is a great way of sort of teaching yourself how to think about things. So it becomes a dominant 7th chord, and you'll also notice that I changed it to a C7 flat 9. So what's going on here? Clearly something is happening. We're departing, we're going somewhere else. Well, remember how I said in measure 5 we modulate to the key of the 4? Well, we want to do something to prepare ourselves to modulate to that key. Now, let's think about the most typical way to modulate. What we use is the 5 chord of the key that we're going to, and that sort of prepares our ears and prepares the progression to go to our new key. So it makes sense. What is the 5 of F minor? Well, it's C7. So what we're doing is we're changing our 1 chord to what we call a 5 of 4, the 5 chord of the key of the 4. And that's what we're doing by making it a dominant chord. And typically when we are modulating to a minor key, we want to use a 5 with a flat 9. So we're doing all those things. Our C minor 7 chord becomes C7 flat 9 to prepare ourselves to modulate to the key of that 4. So now what we have is 3 measures of the 1 chord. Then we have 1 measure that is a 5 of 4. And then in measure 5, we're going to modulate to the 4 chord. So let's see what that all sounds like together. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let me play that for you one more time because that's a very interesting progression. 2, 3, 4. So can you hear how that C7 flat 9 is just such a great chord? It really gets us into the F minor, and we feel like we're home when we go to the key of the 4 after that preparatory chord. So then what we do is we hang out in the key of the 4 for measures 5 and 6 for 2 bars, and then we go back to the 1 chord in measure 7. And that's very, very typical of a major blues as well. So that should make a lot of sense to you. Now, here's something in the most basic form of the minor blues that we're not going to do. We're not going to play a 6 chord because the turnaround is going to be a little bit different. So we're just going to hang out on that 1 chord for another 2 bars, okay? So now if I were to play measures 5 through measure 8, then you're going to hear we start in the key of the 4. Now we're going to go back to 1. And now we're in measure 9. So here's where the biggest difference, in my opinion, between the major blues and the minor blues comes in. We're going to do a different turnaround. instead of doing a 2-5-1, which is what you would totally expect, we're going to play this chord progression that is flat 6 to 5 to 1. And it gives us a very, very different sound, a very interesting sound. And I just love this turnaround, and you see it all the time in the minor blues. So what this is going to sound like, we're going to go to the flat 6 dominant chord, which is going to be A flat 7 in the key of C. Then we're going to go to our regular old 5 chord, but we're going to include a flat 9 because, again, we're resolving to a minor chord, and we like to use that flat 9 in our dominant chord a lot of the time. And then we're simply going to resolve back to 1 in measure 11, and then we're going to go to the 5, and that's going to bring us back around to the top of the form with some kind of momentum. So here's what the turnaround sounds like in the minor blues. 2, 3, 4. Let me play that for you one more time. 2, 3, 4. And then we're back into the top, ready to go back around that 12 measure progression. So let's put the whole thing together, follow along with the sheet, and let's start wrapping our ears around what this progression actually sounds like. So from the top, here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we start modulating to the 4. Back to 1. And here's our new turnaround. Turn back around to the top. It's kind of hard to play and talk at the same time, but I just wanted to kind of interject with some of those places that we're going and all the things that we've talked about in this episode. All right, so here is your assignment for the week. What I would like you to do is wrap your ears around this progression. I'm going to include a play along, a backing track for all of the $5 patrons, and it's going to be at a nice slow tempo. What I want you to do is just listen to that progression go by a little bit, get used to the way that the chord progression differs from the major blues, and then start to do some basic improvisation over it. I think most of you out there are advanced enough to actually just start doing a few things over the top of it. You know how to play over these chords if you've been listening to this podcast for a long time. So just go ahead and start experimenting with some stuff and get used to the most basic form, because what we're going to do is we're going to start adding some things as we go through the month here. So I want you to be familiar with the most basic form of it. Now, the second thing that I want you to do is I want you to learn probably the most common melody that people play over a C minor blues, and that is John Coltrane's Mr. Peacey. So what I want you to do is find that melody and learn it and memorize it. Just so you have something ready to go after the series is over. You have a tune that you can call at a jam session or at one of your gigs that is a C minor blues. Okay, so those are your two assignments. Start getting familiar with the chord progression and learn Mr. Peacey and memorize it. That's really, really important. And remember, if you want to get the PDF with everything diagrammed out so you can have that for your practice folder or whatever, your records, then make sure you go over to Patreon, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, get yourself signed up today, and you get access to that along with a lot of other stuff over there. So check that out, and thank you to all of our patrons that keep this show up and running. All right, we'll see you next week. We're going to start to explore some differences in the progression and do some new things that are really going to make your minor blues solos stand out from the crowd. So we'll see you then. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon. Stay safe and healthy. Bye.